So when the vagus nerve is stimulated, it results in chemical changes of our monoamine metabolism. And drugs that increase our monoamines, those monoamines being serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine, are said to be antidepressant. So what we're seeing here is vagus nerve stimulation having antidepressant actions in our body. Wouldn't it be really cool if eating foods that were bitter could do the same thing? So if bitter foods could stimulate the vagus nerve, we'd find that they'd be safe. We've been having bitters for over thousands of years. There's very few concerns with safety, overdose, the normal surgical concerns you would have with having a surgery and an implant put into you with the vagus nerve stimulation therapy. And yeah, you could work with a herbalist to find the right bitter for you, and you'd find the same effects that you would get, the same changes in the neurotransmitters and improved cognition. So let's go a little bit more into this connection. So vagus nerve tone and why it's important. Vagal tone is correlated with the ability and capacity to regulate certain stresses and to have better regulation to stimulation that's aggravating. So instead of going into a very anxious or a very angered state when we're stimulated with aggression, having better vagal tone is associated with better capacity to regulate and better mitigation of these mood and anxiety symptoms that many of us suffer from. So that's why vagal tone is important. A bit more on this gut-brain connection I've brought up. So it's a growing interest for many reasons, both neurologically, we're really interested in it with PTSD, anxiety, and depression, but also like physically presenting things like IBS. And it's recognized this gut-brain axis as a communication route that's not just the vagus nerve, it's also endocrine and immune and the microbiome gut-brain connection. And the vagus nerve is not the main thing that's being involved here. There's many small things all at work, but it's really cool. It's a really interesting field. So bitter taste activation. When these bitter receptors are activated in our digestive tract, and I'm mainly speaking here about our large and small intestines. So when these bitter taste receptors are activated, they release calcium ion. And this calcium ion release leads to the release of cholecystokinin. And then this will then transmit a signal to the brain through the vagus nerve. And this will then modify food intake, but it will also improve memory and retrieval and inhibitory control, because once it hits the brain, it's going to release norepinephrine and dopamine and serotonin, and we're going to get all those wonderful benefits from that signal being sent, because that signal being sent is what's increasing our vagus nerve tone. So the taste receptor stimulation leads to the activation of our G protein, which is, again, that bitter receptor, which in turn activates a secondary messenger, and these secondary messengers increase the release of these calcium ions, and the release of the calcium ions is what induces our neurotransmitter release, and that neurotransmitter release is what's sending the signal to the brain. So there's actually a really relevant study done on bitters and the vagus nerve connection. So it's 60 people participated between the ages of 45 and 64 years old, all with self-awareness of cognitive decline. And they were taking something called IAAs, isoalpha acids, which are the main bitter component in beer, and also matured hops bitter acid, which is from aged hops. And I should note that they were using these extractions and not beer in this study. So what was really cool is they found that the IAAs, the main component of beer, were strong antagonists of our bitter taste receptors. And this was found to enhance cognitive function by activating the vagus nerve, and then it was also helping with dopamine neurotransmitter release. It also enhanced hippocampus-dependent memory and prefrontal cortex-associated cognitive function. And these two things were done via the dopamine neurotransmitter activation. The matured bitter hops acid was also found to stimulate the vagus nerve, and it enhanced memory function by way of stimulating the vagus nerve and also by way of enhancing norepinephrine signaling. And the people in this study were taking 35 milligrams a day for 12 weeks. And it also significantly relieved fatigue and tension anxiety. So what's really interesting is that we got these two bitter compounds, both found in the same plant, that are both binding to receptors and toning the vagus nerve, but then having different monoamine effects, one being dopamine and one being norepinephrine. So that's showing the toning and the different receptor tuning that needs to happen for bitters to stimulate the vagus nerve. So in summary, vagus nerve stimulation is possible by way of bitters. There still needs to be more done on what bitters cause what effect, what monoamines they're doing. I'd also love to see how much stimulation is being caused, if vagus nerve stimulation can be measured, and what herbs cause the most measurable effects. I really loved the confirmation of finding out that bitters are beyond digestion, which I think most herbalists already knew, but it was really great to discover more about it. And in the future, there's a lot more studies being done on bitters. Beyond the vagus nerve, there's some interesting papers coming out about how they can suppress microganglial activation, which is involved in pathogen-associated molecular patterns, which is a big piece of autoimmunity. More bitters on the anti-inflammatory pathway, being able to act on 3 different pathways that are involved in inflammation, which is really neat. Bitters also being looked into for Alzheimer's disease. There are really beneficial effects of using bitters for chronic rhinosinusitis as well. And I found a piece looking into bitters and their association with cardiac function. So it's all a new frontier in science, and it was truly pleasurable to look into it and read. I've attached a short piece underneath this podcast with just references to where I found my information, and I've also given a little bit of a rating for how trustworthy that information is and how much it should be taken with a grain of salt. I hope you enjoy listening to my rant about bitters, and I hope you go reach for a bitter the next time you are in the cupboard. Have a great day.